Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Digital Classroom. And Digital Classroom is made possible by BenQ and Rogue. Now, do you ever wonder how you should set up your camera? I know, of course, most of you guys are shooting RAW, and if you don't, please make sure that you do. But how should you set up your camera? Should you use sRGB, Adobe RGB? Should you actually set your color temperature or contrast and brightness? How? Well, lately I've been receiving some emails and also on social media with exactly that same question. Now, when you look online, there are a lot of people telling you stuff. And most of all, well, the truth is in the middle, because photography, of course, is an art form. So if somebody asks me like, hey Frank, how should I place my lighting? That is something that is always up for discussion, because maybe I like it a little bit more from the left, or you like it a little bit more from the right, or maybe flat on. But when it comes to RAW files, or for example how a light meter works, there is actually no reason to debate this, because it's very well documented and it's very easy to understand. So that's why I decided to make this very short video for you guys about the RAW file. Now, what is a RAW file? A RAW file is literally the sensor readout. So why do you have all these settings in your camera? Well, if you look at your camera, you can actually see that you have two options to set up. There are of course more, but two main options. You can shoot on RAW, or you can shoot on JPEG. Now, what is JPEG? JPEG is a compressed file format. It's an 8-bit file format, so it's not a really, let me put it this way, you can't push the pixels around a lot in Photoshop, but it's a very compact image size. And it's something that's compatible with everything. So if you have an iPhone or an Android or an older tablet or whatever you want to use, JPEG is a pretty good option to shoot in, because, well, everybody can see your images. It's also the image size that you, for example, use for Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. It's just, let me put it this way, the easy to choose solution. Now, another thing with JPEG is all the images already look great, because you have contrast, you have brightness set up, you have saturation, and it just looks great. Now, when you go to the RAW file, that changes a little bit. RAW files are often a little bit flat, they can be a little bit softer than the JPEGs, and the reason for this is very simple. It's the straight sensor RAW output. Now, I don't want to make it too complicated, but if you're a really technical guy, listen to this. You can of course do the raw output from your sensor, but you can also compress that a little bit. Now, Sony is a great example for that. They have the compressed raw output and they have the uncompressed raw output. So in other words, they compress it a little bit without too much loss, and they can give you the full raw sensor output. So that's a huge file. Let's skip that part and go straight to the question asked. Should you set up your camera if you're shooting RAW for color temperature, brightness or color space? On all three, no. I'm going to explain you very simple why. The RAW file is the raw output from your sensor. That means it's literally what the sensor sees. Now, if you look at color spaces, for example sRGB, that's a fixed color space. If you look at Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB, those are fixed color spaces. So why has your camera the option for Adobe RGB and sRGB if just before I told you that RAW files are the raw data from your sensor? That's because you can also shoot JPEGs, remember? And for JPEGs it's very important, because JPEGs, everything is put together. In other words, you have this final image, and that's the final image. So contrast and brightness is set, color temperature is set, and of course the color space is set. So it's a one package. Now, if you look at the RAW file, there's something slightly different. You actually have the raw data output from your sensor, and you have a smaller file that's embedded in the RAW file, by the way, and it's called metadata. Now, in that metadata, you actually have everything that you set in your camera. So if you use contrast, brightness, color space or color temperature, that is embedded in your RAW file, but only as metadata. And I'm going to show you very quickly, in a very simple way, how that works. Okay, so here we have a piece of paper. Now let's first look at the JPEG. So the JPEG is actually the image. And inside the image, everything is set up. So if you have a curve like this, that's actually embedded into the JPEG. If you have, for example, a color space, sRGB, it's embedded inside the JPEG. So everything is embedded, it's the one final solution. Color temperature, everything is inside. Okay, now let's go to the raw file. The raw file is actually the raw output of your sensor. Now next to the raw file, there's another table. And you can call that metadata. Actually, it's called metadata. Now in that metadata, all the settings you use from your JPEG is actually translated into this table. So you have color temperature, color space, brightness, contrast, whatever. Now, how does this work when, for example, you open up your file in Lightroom? Because in Lightroom or Capture One, you actually see everything that's in this file, in this metadata part, you see in your image. So how does that work? Well, let me switch this over. So let's say we now have Lightroom. Now Lightroom reads your metadata. Now Lightroom sees your raw file and it will actually tell your settings, which you find on this side. And it will tell you, okay, the metadata was this. So all your sliders will actually move to the positions that, well, you had set your camera up the moment you took the shot. So now your image will actually have the curve. We'll have, for example, sRGB, and oops, and we'll have everything else. But these sliders you can of course change yourself again. So in other words, a raw file, I can just do whatever I want with the file, because the file itself is still exactly the same. It's only the metadata that is read. So in other words, if you have a JPEG into Lightroom or Capture One, that's a complete package. It's a compressed file. Let me put it this way. It's compressed, so, well, you can throw it away because you can't push the pixels that much anymore. So if you have set up your color temperature, for example, to 5000 degrees Kelvin, and the original color temperature was 2800 degrees Kelvin, you're pretty much in problems because you can't correct that anymore. You can correct it a little bit, but you can't correct it a lot. Now, if you have a raw file, like this one, this is not compressed. You only have that metadata part on that side. So that actually means that now I can move those sliders every way I want. Now I hear you guys going like, yeah Frank, you tell this, but other people tell something else. Well, you don't need a laboratory or you don't need fancy equipment to test this yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to shoot some images with a color checker, and we're going to shoot it on a setting called RAW plus JPEG. On your camera you can actually set that setting to RAW plus JPEG. So what it does, exactly the same shot is captured in RAW and in JPEG. So the moment that you take those into Lightroom or Capture One, you will see two files, the JPEG and the RAW from the same scene. We're going to use a color checker for this, and we're going to actually set up the camera for a very low color temperature and a very high color temperature. I'm actually going to go to the maximum that my Sony camera supports. And then I'm going to show you guys, very simple, that there's no difference for the RAW file, but there's a huge difference for the JPEG. And I hope that clears up that, well, that rumor that's going around that if you set up your color temperature for your RAW file, that everything will be easier to correct. So let's head over to Lightroom or Capture One, whatever we're going to use, and we're going to show you exactly how it works with your RAW file versus the JPEG. Okay guys, we're in Lightroom and I've selected all the color checkers. So here we have the JPEG. Sorry, this is the JPEG, this is the RAW. Here we have the RAW, the JPEG, RAW and JPEG. As you can see, they all have the same color tint, and that's because I shot one on the lowest setting on my camera, that's 2400 degrees Kelvin, and one on the highest, which is around 9900 degrees Kelvin. So that's way too blue. So let's see what happens if we look at the, well, RAW file. As you can see here, you see a color temperature. Of course, that's not accurate. Let's take the color picker and just select this one. There we go. So my strobes are actually, according to Lightroom, 50/50 by +4. Now this can change a little bit. Now let's go to the JPEG. As you can see, there's no color temperature here, and that's because it's all embedded. So in other words, you can change it, but you can only have a little bit of latitude. As you can see here, it doesn't really work. But that's of course something you already know, and that's not what this video is about. So here we have the RAW file and the JPEG. Now these are, of course, a little bit too reddish. So let's take our color picker. And let's take this. And let's go to the JPEG and do exactly the same. There we go. Okay, now for the final one. This one was pretty accurate. So this one was the one where I guesstimated my strobe's temperature and actually put it on. So this JPEG should have no problem looking natural. There we go. Okay, so now the whole story is, should I embed, or in other words, should I set my color temperature in camera right at the moment of shooting? Now, it sounds logical, right? But it actually isn't, because watch this. Raw file, raw file, raw file. And these were set on the most extreme settings on the camera. So the lowest possible color temperature and the highest possible color temperature. And as you can see, there's absolutely no difference between the raw files. Now, if you look at the JPEGs, this is a different story. JPEG just can't correct that much. So you will never get really close to the original, which should be the raw files you can see here. And JPEGs are, of course, a little bit more contrasty because the raw files are a little bit more flat. Now, you can, of course, solve this too in your camera. And this is one of the tips I always give people. Just put your contrast down and your brightness up, and your JPEGs will look a little bit like your raw files. Why is that important? Well, because often in the field we try to judge our exposures on the back of the camera. And if you have a JPEG, you will actually see the skies, well, a little bit overblown, while in essence, in the raw file, there's a lot more latitude. So that's one simple trick. Just put your contrast down and your brightness up for your JPEG settings, and your back on your camera will look a little bit like your raw file. But as you can see here, it's proven you don't need to set your color temperature for your raw files, because even in the most extreme settings, they all look exactly the same. And that's because it's only metadata. So contrast, brightness, color space, color temperature, it doesn't matter. It's all metadata in the raw file. In the JPEG, as you can see here, it's embedded. So make sure that in the JPEG, if you're a JPEG shooter, you are very, very picky about how to set your color temperature, because you can't correct it afterwards. Now, as you see, there's absolutely no reason to ask questions like this, because you can test it out yourself. And this is one of the things that I actually want to give to you guys. If you see something online and you hear somebody telling you it has to be like this or it has to be like that, and in your mind you go like, really? Don't just go blind on what people tell you. It's very, very easy to test out. You just use something, you shoot it, and you can experiment yourself in Photoshop. And I think this will actually solve a lot of the questions that are online. But for now, I hope this was clear. Thank you so very much for watching. If you like what we do, leave comments below, smash that like button, and of course subscribe to our channel. But most of all, share this video so a lot of people can enjoy it and learn something out of it. See you again next time. Bye bye.